So about 2 years ago, I got very active in privacy promoting stuff. And I was looking for speakers for this conference. And I was using Home Assistant and OwnTracks and all that kind of technology. And I thought, well, we should have at least one speaker from this area for this conference. You might not know this, but it's very easy to get Jan-Piet through the programming committee, because he's a well-known speaker for the NLUUG. So it was quite good to get him to promote on OwnTracks. So I hope he can tell you an interesting story of how OwnTracks came about, and I hope some of the things that wait for the future. Take it away.
Thank you, Koen. I was wondering why I'm here, but now I know you're our fan. Good, very good. Everything was fine this morning until Mark, who's doing the video again, thankfully, has now told me that I'm using 4 to 3 slides. So I beg your pardon that there's a black space on the left and right on the screen. It shouldn't be there, but anyway. So we're going to tell you a little bit about the story of OwnTracks. My name is Jan-Piet, or JP. I've been doing lots of different things. I've been speaking here also. I've had the honor of speaking here at the NLUUG several times. I do all sorts of things like Ansible and so on. I would have spoken to you about Ansible today, but I didn't want to steal Dag's show, so we'll talk about OwnTracks. Question for the audience: who knows of OwnTracks? About 32.7%. Okay. Who actually uses OwnTracks? Right. Half a dozen. Yeah, approximately half a dozen people. Nice. Nice. So OwnTracks, before telling you about how OwnTracks started, let me tell you what OwnTracks actually is. OwnTracks allows you to keep tracks of your location. So what we do, OwnTracks is an open source project. What we do is we have 2 applications, 2 apps for smartphone, for Android and for iOS. And these apps let you track where you are or where family members are, or friends are, etc. We'll show you why you would want to do that at all. Now, OwnTracks started because once upon a time there was Google Latitude. Google Latitude was a project, a Google project, of course, which was, I think, I'm not going to even quite sure, but I think relatively popular with people who wanted to keep track of their locations, who wanted to know where they were, who wanted to know, for example, where was I last year? For me, that was a stupid question because I was here last year, but for people who travel a lot and who want to, after maybe a certain amount of time, say, well, dear, where did we go on holidays last year, or where were we 2 years ago? So Google Latitude was relatively popular, and Google Latitude showed a map, and this map had photos of friends or acquaintances on it, and so on. But of course, Google Latitude was a Google service. It was sunset approximately 2012, I think 2011, 2012, 2013, somewhere about there. Google had big data, so Latitude collected purposely, of course, because you signed up for it, or the people who signed up for it, had big data. This is the kind of JSON payload that Google Latitude stored. The advantage is we had access to this. So I tested Google Latitude, and this is a data record that I picked up in, I think I was stopped at a parking lot in Friedrichsdorf or something. I would never, unless I made a huge mistake, but I would not show you the location of where I live because of privacy reasons. We are very, very strong in that area. So one day, I had a little bit of a very crazy idea, and the result of this crazy idea is why I'm standing here talking to you about OwnTracks. The crazy idea started because this was during a time where I did a lot with MQTT. Who's heard of MQTT? Oh, very good. For the camera, over half of the participants now here, of the listeners. That's nice. So I was doing quite a bit with MQTT. We do a lot with MQTT. And suddenly it occurred to me that it should be trivial. It turned out to be far from trivial, but it should be trivial to have a smartphone app which records where I am. All these smartphone apps, or all these smartphones have GPS, don't they? So it should be trivial to have a smartphone app which detects where I am and publishes this information over MQTT to a broker, an MQTT broker. The broker is a server, the server component of MQTT. Publishes this information to an MQTT broker, and it would be all mine. The data would be mine. Nobody would have it. In particular, Google wouldn't have it. And I thought this was an excellent idea. And of course, we would do a lot with privacy. We would ensure security. We would ensure transport security, and we would make it very easy. So this was the actual idea. What then happened is I spoke with Alexander Rust, here on the right. Alexander Rust, I knew because he was working on a small automation program, also with MQTT. So I knew that he wrote smartphone apps, at least for Android. And I said to him, well, what do you think it would be a good idea? And he said, yeah, let me see if I can write a prototype. And more or less simultaneously, a few days later, actually, my very old friend and still very, very good friend, Christophe, who I then found out was writing apps for iOS, also showed up and said, okay, yeah, let's do it. Let's try it. And what you see here are, as far as my recollection, or if my recollection still works, what you see here are 2 screenshots of the original OwnTracks apps, as they were called at the time. First of all, we invented a super cool name. We did this over MQTT, and it was an ersatz for Latitude, so how else to call it than MQTT-tude? I think I am one of 3 people who can actually pronounce that. Yeah, so that was what it was supposed to be called. This is the original Android app, which was, of course, trivial. I had to push a button, the update that would then request from the operating system, where am I? Because the operating systems are the mobile OSs are the components that actually produce the GPS. And then I could press on publish, and then the MQTT message went out. And this is the iOS version that Christophe wrote. At the time, he chose that name as a prototype name. And this was a marvelous app. The iOS. I'm an iOS user. I have an iPhone, and so I was testing this stuff nonstop. And the early iOS versions, they were really great. They allowed me to sleep in very nicely, because I used to download the latest version maybe at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then go to sleep. And typically half an hour later, the battery was completely drained, so I never was woken up in the next morning. So that was really, really cool. What then happened was something fantastic happened. Andy Stanford Clark, who's the inventor of MQTT, almost 20 years ago, he created, while being a master inventor at IBM, he created MQTT. And Andy Stanford Clark heard about us, and he tweeted this: "Woo, this is cool. MQTT-tude is the MQTT alternative to Google Latitude." Now, at this time, our app started becoming something. That means our app actually started working more or less reliably. And we had a number of people who were interested in MQTT. We had a number of people who were actually using our apps to basically to do 2 things, as far as we know anyway, to do 2 things. And one is have a record of where these people were. And the other thing is we found a number of people were interested in using this app, this technology, to do home automation. So, for example, I approach my home, and the garage door should open, and the garden irrigation should stop. Yeah? So we had a number of people doing things like that. And that was the moment where we decided MQTT-tude is really a really super cool tech-sounding name, but nobody can pronounce it. So we decided to rebrand, which was a good thing. There were quite a number of people, quite a number of voices who said, no, don't do it. MQTT-tude is a really nice-sounding name. But we decided to, and we chose the name OwnTracks to indicate, first of all, that we do tracking, that these apps record tracks. Okay, OwnTracks. And second of all, the word own was to indicate to you that it's your data. You, not only it's your own data, but you actually own the data. It's yours. So there's nothing between OwnTracks and you, except the NSA, of course, and we can't switch those off, so unfortunately. So OwnTracks started up the whole idea around OwnTracks got wind. OwnTracks requires, and that wasn't necessarily trivial, OwnTracks requires an infrastructure. So we need an MQTT server, that's our broker. You have your apps, for example, on Android or iOS, on technically or potentially other platforms. Koen this morning asked whether we thought about creating a Debian version for the new, what's it called, Debian smartphone? Librem what? Librem. Okay, Librem. That's the new something. The advantage is that we have these apps on Android and iOS, and technically also on other platforms. They publish via MQTT to the MQTT server broker. You can record this information, of course, and you could theoretically, or not only theoretically, we could from the word go, but you can decide whether you want to, for example, share this data with other clients that are connected to your same broker. Those may be family members, and maybe friends, maybe other devices you have, and so we wanted to offer the possibility to have sort of family and friends on the same broker. And this setting this up is not trivial. For a technical person like you are, it basically is trivial. Is Jos here? Yeah, yes. Even Jos managed. Huh? That was below the belt, and I don't mean that. I learned from Jos many, many years ago how to create RPM packages, so he really knows his way. But this is, of course, non-trivial for non-technical people. So what we did already way from the beginning was to invest quite a bit of time and effort in creating what we call the booklet. That is our documentation, and which is, I must say, I think, and we've been complimented on this several times, I think the booklet is quite good. The only thing that is severely lacking, or has been severely lacking in the past, is the actual documentation on the apps. We strongly believe, we is the three of us, Christophe, Alexander, and myself, we strongly believe that the apps are self-explanatory, which is rubbish, of course, but we tend to believe that they are self-explanatory. The whole backend side, the whole server side, that is not necessarily self-explanatory, which is why we went to a lot of trouble to create the booklet, where we also explain what is MQTT, what do you do with it, what does OwnTracks do, how is privacy important, and so on. And what we also, one of the reasons we did this is because, let me go back shortly, because this is non-trivial, we started seeing on the public brokers, on the public MQTT brokers, of which there are a number, and these brokers do not enforce authentication, they do not enforce transport layer security. You are all, most of you are older. It's not, you knew it as TLS. I'm sorry, you knew it as SSL, it's now called TLS. They do not enforce TLS, transport layer security. So what we've been seeing on these brokers is location information. People who test out our apps and immediately publish their information. Sometimes it's non-trivial, I beg your pardon, sometimes it's trivial to determine who it actually was. I'll show you an example in a moment. And so this is bad. That's why we went to particular effort in our documentation, our booklet to point that out. So what do our apps actually do? Our apps run, as I say, on Android and or on iOS, for the time being anyway, and they collect location information, they collect GPS information, and this GPS information is transmitted as a JSON blob, a JSON object. And this JSON object was originally designed to be simple. It has a type, location type, and it has at the very least 3 additional elements. First of all, a timestamp. This is the Unix epoch timestamp when this location information was published. and it has a latitude and a longitude information. These numbers here were originally strings because we thought it would be very, very important to get the exact precision as it was returned to us by the operating system. We then very quickly decided to drop that because a precision of 9 digits, 9 decimal points is completely irrelevant. I think, what was it, 6 decimal points is 5 meters or something, it's more than enough. And what our apps can do, or your own applications which create which create OwnTracks compatible JSON, is to add additional elements. So one thing that, for example, then later on showed up is a so-called TID, a tracker ID, which shows up on a map under certain circumstances. I'll show you an example in a moment. Then we have additional values which are collected by the smartphone. So, for example, the velocity, course over ground, the altitude above sea level, things like that. What we also add then for monitoring is the battery level. For example, I can tell my wife that she should please now plug in her iPhone because otherwise it's going to die. Yeah? So we can do monitoring on that level. Then things, I don't have an example here. We got a very interesting query, if I recall correctly, from somebody in Australia. I think it was somebody in Australia who wanted to use iPhone 6 models to do weather forecasts, and they asked us whether we would be able to add pressure. I said, huh, pressure? And he said, yeah, the iPhone 6 models have a pressure barometer in them. So if you have an iPhone 6 or larger, I don't, then you automatically get the pressure information with the P, the barometer. What we also have added here always is a trigger. So this T, this trigger, indicates, for example, how this record was originally produced. The M stands for mobile data, contrary to, for example, Wi-Fi data or so-called ping, etc. Our apps today are relatively capable, not to say very capable. We run it in production. We know there are many people who do. Here on the left is Android. On the right is iOS. They all have a map. Here you have this tracker ID. Here it says M3, or here in yellow M3. That's this. Excuse me. Let me go back. That's the tracker ID where it says JJ here, we can also, we have support for so-called what we call cards, where you can add an image and a name and so on. These names then show up in the friends list, which I'll show you in a moment. So yeah, we're quite popular. Our apps also have a list of friends. Friends are people who share the same infrastructure, so share the same broker. So for example, if Dag and using OwnTracks and I'm using OwnTracks and we use the same broker, and the broker access control lists actually allow that we see each other because we agree to be able to see each other, then I would show up on his map and he would show up on my map. Okay, so that's the permission model is done server side. What else do we have? We have so-called transition events all the way from the quite a bit from the beginning. We had transition events which are controlled by geofences, which you set up in the apps. So, for example, you can configure a radius of whatever, 100 meters, 200 meters around your house, and as soon as you enter or leave that radius, as soon as you enter or leave that geofence, a transition event is fired off by the application, but the application, our app, is woken up by the operating system. So it makes it quite reliable. And people, we know for a fact, people do quite a bit with these transition events. Here, record type transition, and they have an event, enter or leave. Quite a bit with these transition events, mainly in the area of automation. And once again, that is very important, and Koen mentioned that already during his introduction. And that is that this data is, if you handle it carefully, this data is shared between your device and your backend, your MQTT broker, and literally nobody else. Okay, so we have no cloud service or other things. This is really, this data is your data. You own the data, and you can do things with this. In the course of time, we've added features. No, that's not true. In the course of time, Christophe has added lots of features to the iOS version. Here are some examples we added. For example, we added support for beacons. This was very, very popular in the iOS world. was greatly desired in the Android world. We have now, though, officially ripped out that support on the Android side, on the side of the Android app, because the implementation is so lousy, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work properly, but on iOS we still have it. And we know of people who use this literally to detect movement also within a house, for example, or within a particular building. And with that, for example, we built a special, here's another feature on the right here, we have an iOS, OwnTracks, and depending on a specific MQTT publish, which is then received by this app, a new pane shows up here called Featured, where we can load a web page, any web page that you desire, that you control via this MQTT publish. And we built this for an organization who wanted to have light control, building lamps controlled by the OwnTracks apps running on their phone. So that was quite interesting. Yeah, then as a matter of course, we thought we should add also the possibility to do HTTP. The reason being, MQTT is not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, which is completely impossible to understand, but anyway, it happens to be that way. So for certain people who are not willing to set up the infrastructure, MQTT broker, etc., but maybe have a shared hosting service somewhere where they can write a PHP page, we added the possibility of actually publishing our information, our location information, and also our event information via HTTP to any desired endpoint that, of course, you specify. And this is a trivial example where somebody picks it up via PHP and then handles it. Now, as I mentioned already to start with, OwnTracks is an open source project. And who of you, I'm curious, who of you have done open source or actually provide open source? Okay, quite a few, about 10, 12. As anybody can attest to, open source can be a royal pain in the ass if you are hammered with requests and people are not really being nice. And one of my pet peeves is people who write the application should do this and should do that and should do that, yeah? Instead of asking whether it's possible to actually do that. But we've had occasional moments which were actually really, really, really wonderful. One moment, and this is a screenshot of an actual ticket that we got. This started a little bit earlier, where we had this user who said the application, iOS, doesn't work properly in significant mode at 800 kilometers per hour. And I spoke to the guy, and I said, I think by mail, and I said, it works fine at 200 kilometers per hour. I drive that all the time, and we do that fine. And he said, no, 800. And I said, I thought you made a typing mistake. I thought you meant 200. He said, no, 800. I said, where the hell do you get 800 kilometers? He said, I'm a fighter pilot. I'm a fighter pilot, and I have an iPhone, and I put that in my uniform when I fly. And at 800 kilometers per hour, the speed indicator on the map doesn't work properly. That was really, really grand. Christophe found the bug within an hour or something, fixed it, of course. But that really, till today, is the loveliest error, the loveliest bug report we ever, at least to my knowledge, we ever got. Yeah? Your app doesn't work nicely at 800 kilometers per hour. That we were expecting anything, but yeah. This is the point at which I would love to give you a whole bunch of statistics. How many users do we have? What do they do? How many messages are sent out per minute, per second, per hour, per day, per whatever? I can't. I can't tell you. Exactly, it's private. I can't tell you. The only thing I can tell you, because we originally had in OwnTracks, we had this software, the name I've forgotten because it's been renamed 3 times. If you're an app developer, you can add a library which I think belongs to Facebook. Christophe was listening at the moment, could tell me, but I'm sorry, I've forgotten what it's called. You could add a library, and whenever the application crashes or whenever it's launched, it reports back. Yeah, it phones home. And already many revisions ago, I said, look, we have to get rid of that. We can't do that. We sell privacy. Yeah, we sell We sell private data. I mean, we don't sell data, but we sell an app that does private data, and we can't do this. So we tore it out. So the only thing we know is number of installs, number of installations, not number of downloads, number of installations. And we currently have somewhere around about between 10 and 12,000 installations on either platform. So about, I think it is 11,000 Android and about 10,000 iOS installations. That's all we know. Okay. What happens occasionally, of course, we know we have a bit of information via mail, we have a bit of information via issues, and so we know what people do with it. Very nice. I was at 2 different events in the course of the last 3 weeks, and 4 or 5 people came up to me and said, I use OwnTracks and we do this with it and so on. So if you use OwnTracks, then tell us about it. Send us an email, whatever, tell us about it. It's really great to know. Way back, we got the request to be able to do OwnTracks from vehicles, and the original idea was to take simple Android phones and put them on the vehicles. This turned into an absolute disaster because what the customer actually wanted was sort of up-to-the-minute information, and it's just not possible with the mobile apps. So we thought we'd do it ourselves. Well, don't. The combination of hardware like this here just rattles to pieces within 120 kilometers. Okay, it's just incapable. What then happened is we were contacted by a company, a small Italian company who creates automotive GPS receivers. And we actually created a completely new firmware for this, MQTT-based firmware. And this has been very successful. We even went to the trouble to, for example, minimize the payloads, our JSON that was being produced by these Greenwich products. We created our own comma-separated values, for example, where we take the timestamp, okay, the epoch timestamp, and we hexalize it in order to shorten it. Okay, so relatively trivial, but by doing so, we cut the payload size from approximately 140, 150 bytes down to 80. So that's really worthwhile when you're talking a large number of vehicles publishing every minute or even half minute. We're talking real money. So those are things that have turned out to be very worthwhile. In doing so, what we also found out, of course, that SIM cards are very important. If you do something like this, don't go out and buy something cheap. Think of roaming, okay? You want to be able to roam throughout the whole of Europe. We found a provider that does this very, very reliably, and so that is very important. Then other things were built, for example, Ben Jones, who also made the openHAB contribution, I'll show you in a second, did something also together with these Greenwich devices. He had a client, a plumber, who wanted to be able to control certain operations from the vehicle, so he built something for that. We had a bunch of infrastructure that was built in the back. We had something we called Pista, which was able to keep track of these things. We had a special iOS app called Control with a backend server software, which I created, where we could exactly determine where particular vehicles are. This was for a customer who has quite a number of vehicles which run OwnTracks in the vehicle. Okay, so we've had hardware with OwnTracks capabilities in them. We now have a different system. I brought one along. You can have a look at it in a moment. This is made by a company called Quicklink. It doesn't speak MQTT, but that doesn't matter. The software that we created speaks MQTT, and of course creates OwnTracks compatible payloads. So these things you sort of throw into a car. They have a SIM card, obviously, on board, and an optional antenna. And these are quite successful and tremendously reliable, in particular for organizations who want an up-to-the-minute information on where their devices are. We have a number of backend systems that have been created within the OwnTracks project. And one of the most important things that we found with OwnTracks and around OwnTracks, and one of maybe the most interesting things that people have been doing with OwnTracks, as far as we know, because we don't know, is that they use the data by themselves. Of course, if you go out and buy a vehicle from whatever, Mercedes-Benz and so, you get, if you buy a truck for €500,000, it comes with a GPS system on board. But all you get as the owner of that vehicle is maybe access to a web-based platform where you can look, where is my vehicle, or where has it been the last 30 days. But it's not your data. You can't get that data. Okay? So whether you use a device or whether you use a smartphone, doesn't really matter. In all cases, it should be your data, and you should be able to use it as you want. And a couple of examples that have happened is that we, for example, created for Slack a trivial system where is user, and we can, because we know where the data is and because we have access to the data, our data, of course, I can find out, let us here again assume Dag and I are connected to the same system. Then I could enter where is Dag, and I would find out, okay, he's at the moment in Utrecht. I can find this out now visually too, but that's a different kettle of fish. So in the OwnTracks ecosystem, we have a number of things for home automation. Koen already mentioned we have Home Assistant already from more or less from day one of OwnTracks was, don't quote me with the day one, but very, very early on was already part of Home Assistant. The person or the people behind Home Assistant were quite interested in OwnTracks and immediately embedded it. We have our friend Ben, who created the integration into openHAB. openHAB, the open home automation broker, also for home automation, very, very solid. We have things like Zanzito, which is a gateway for Android phones. It's a gateway whereby you can send out different information via MQTT. So also for the devices, for the sensors on the Android phone, you send out via MQTT. And Zanzito, the reason I mention them here is Zanzito, for example, in their documentation, very nice documentation. Documentation is highly important. Very good documentation. They describe an OwnTracks compatible mode. So we've created sort of a little bit of a name. Traccar, the Traccar.org people, this is a screenshot of it. They have a very large piece of Java software which does vehicle tracking with all sorts of different devices. We created for them the OwnTracks compatible protocol decoder, which is now part of the Traccar ecosystem. So there's bits and pieces of OwnTracks have been spread all over the world, a little bit all over the world in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Yeah, this, my last piece of map. I once blogged that our furthest away user was down here, south of Australia. And I knew that because he sent us, I won't tell you who it is, of course, but he sent us, or sent me, a JSON object. I was supposed to debug it, there was something wrong with it. So I know the geographic position where that person is. Of course, this was completely wrong because our friend Ben Jones has been working together with the project already for a number of years. He lives in New Zealand, so this was completely off. Yeah? But I still like this piece of map. So yeah, that more or less covers OwnTracks, what it is, where it came from, how it got to be, and try it. It's nice. It's fun. It can be practical. We know several people who like it, I myself included, because we travel a lot. I travel a lot. My wife travels a lot. My other family members travel a lot. And we like seeing where is the other person. I wouldn't show you now on a big screen, but if you come to me later on, I would show you in private, at least part of the map. And you can see I'll hide certain people, but I can, for example, show you approximately where Christophe is at the moment, because I know because we communicate a lot. So OwnTracks is quite alive, and yeah, have a look at it. It's as I say, it's fun and it's interesting, and I think the most important thing is, and I wish that more people would create software like that. It is your data. That's it. Thank you. Koen, do we have time for a question or two? Yeah?
More than ample time. Any questions?
Loud and clearly, please. I'm hard of hearing.
I get the mic. How open or how closed is the use of Google Maps instead of OpenStreetMaps, for instance?
How open or how closed? That's a very interesting question. I would like to not answer that question, or let's say I would like to answer it in the following way. We have decided to do everything with OpenStreetMap. Does that answer your question? One of the main reasons, well, there are a few reasons. First of all, OpenStreetMap is really completely open. You can download a planet.osm file, which is compressed 7 gig. It takes a shitload of resource. I beg your pardon. It takes a double shitload of resources to unpack, but it's really, really worthwhile. So you literally have everything. And I'm going to tell you a story. We had a client recently who is running these on a whole number of vehicles. And this person said, we want to know when our vehicles stop at a petrol station. We want to know that. Why? It doesn't really matter. I can tell you later on, but the story's a bit long. So I thought, petrol station. How the hell do we know where something in a petrol station? Well, if you dive into the OSM data, they were all in there. Yeah, and it took a while for me to figure it out, and then I had some help, for example, from Andrew Grouse, who also works with us on the Android app, thankfully. I had a little bit of help, but I now have a CDB. I use CDB, or no, LMDB actually, a database with 14,000 petrol stations in Europe. So whenever one of these vehicles stops at a petrol station, boom, this client gets an information. Now, I'll promise you one thing: we can't do that with Google, okay? Because it's their data. So, my personal opinion is the Google Maps. They look much nicer. That's my personal, my personal feeling. They look much nicer. But they probably look much nicer because Google's pumped umpteen millions of dollars into the map development, yeah? Whereas OpenStreetMap hasn't. But we've decided to move to everything OpenStreetMap. So, for example, we use OpenCage as a geodecoder, reverse geodecoder. It's important for us to know. Our apps show that, for example, and it's important for people to know where is the vehicle. I mean, the latitude, longitude is one thing, but we want to know the address, which street, which house number, and so on. So we tend to use OpenCage, which are very, very nice people, and they not only are they very, very nice people, but they allow us to cache reverse geolookups. Neither Google nor any of the other large providers allow you to cache those results. So Google says in the fine print, which you have to read, you are not allowed to cache this data. That means that every time you have the same position, you have to re-look it up. But with only 2,500, for example, free lookups, I think it is per day, I've forgotten the time frame, I think it's per day, you very, very quickly pass that. No? So OpenStreetMap is worthwhile looking into. I hope I've somehow answered your question. In the back, Koen Hagen has a question.
The security of your data certainly depends on the security of your MQTT broker. And
yes, correct.
And I'm sure that a lot of MQTT guys know how to set up a high available and secure MQTT broker. But do you have some sort of description how to really make sure that, I mean, from an OwnTracks perspective, that your MQTT server that you might set up somewhere is secure and high available?
Well, no, we do not. We of course we cannot enforce high availability. High availability, that is your problem. If you say you want a highly available broker, then it's up to you to set that up. We have excellent experience with some of the open source brokers. That is Mosquito, written by Roger Light, or VernMQ, for example, written in Erlang. Erlang is this language that doesn't die, no? And almost literally doesn't die. Erlang was created, I think, by Ericsson for telephone exchanges, and it just doesn't die. So we have excellent experience with that. If your machine continues running, don't worry, your broker will certainly continue running. That's more or less the last thing to crash. So we cannot enforce high availability. What we have begun doing is, and our next Android version has already removed user ID and password being optional. It used to be optional. You could say, yeah, I want it, or I don't want it. And we've removed that. We've removed that in the user interface. You can still configure it. If you go to a lot of trouble, you can still configure it via a configuration file, which you can upload into the device or into the software. But it's a pain to do so. So we're hoping that by removing this flag, this switch in the user interface, we're hoping that that's going to force people to think a little bit about it. Knowing people like we know people, it's probably going to drop the use of OwnTracks by about 90%, but that's a different problem. Yeah? So we're trying our best, but we cannot enforce it. Yeah? It is, and to my mind, it remains astonishing what, not only with OwnTracks, with most any application, it remains astonishing what data people are willing to just hand over without even thinking about it. It's quite incredible. But I think I'm preaching to the choir, so I'll stop.
Other questions? Okay. Well, I have one question.
Yes.
Are there any exciting new plans to do with OwnTracks in the near future?
Well, exciting is all in the eye of the beholder. There are a couple things that we're working on. First of all, with our apps, we are, or Alexander and Andrew are adding, they have added, but apparently it doesn't work. So I'm saying are adding, or will be adding Tasker support. Tasker is for Android. Help me, you probably know much more about all this than I do. Tasker is some sort of a, what is Tasker?
If this, then else, then that.
Yeah, it's if this, then else. Oh, that's, by the way, that is one service that I consider absolutely incredible. I mean, incredibly bad. Yeah? No, it's grand what they do, but think about what they do. It's just mind-boggling. So if this, then, yeah, if this, then else for your Android. So we'll have Tasker support. In other words, you'll be able to control Tasker from OwnTracks or vice versa. We're adding, or Christophe has added already a, we're not quite sure what to call it, maybe My Fence or My Track or My whatever, a feature to the iOS app which will allow us to improve the publishing precision. When we started OwnTracks, we were very, very careful to minimize the amount of mobile data. So mobile data at the time was very expensive, at the very least in Germany it's very expensive. In Germany, when you get a mobile data contract, you can get a flat rate. Flat rate means 100 bytes per month. Yeah? More or less. And so mobile data is very expensive. And here in the Netherlands, when you get a flat rate at KPN, you can't watch enough porn to satisfy that. Right, so that's a huge difference in Europe. And so mobile data was very expensive. We were very, very careful to limit the amount of publishers. But we have a lot of people who say, we want, please, high precision, so a lot of publishing. And what this iOS feature will do is to set a, here where I am now, it will set an automatic geofence. And as soon as I move out of that geofence, the operating system warns us and tells us, okay, publish this information, and we reset the geofence. So we're basically walking sort of every few steps out of a geofence, and that causes the operating system to wake us up and to allow us to publish. Those are the short-term things.
Yeah, that won't work at Mach 2.
And
that won't work at Mach 2.
That will, exactly. I'm dreading that our fighter pilot will say, it doesn't work at Mach 2. Yeah. But meanwhile, we've decided that if that happens, we say to him, we need to live test. We can't do this offline anymore.
Yeah, what happens when Elon Musk is going to provide it in SpaceX?
I will thankfully not live to see that, but probably anyway. But yeah, we'll see. Good. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Stroopwafels.
Jazeker.
Thank you.
Belangrijk.